In the final months of the First World War, France emerged battered, bloodied, but victorious. The price of that victory was staggering. More than 1 million soldiers dead, countless others maimed, entire regions of the country reduced to cratered wasteland. Villages along the front were obliterated, farmland poisoned by shell fire, forests shredded into skeletal stumps. The memory of Verdun in the Somme was not just military history, it was national trauma. French leaders, generals, and ordinary citizens alike swore that such a calamity must never be allowed to unfold again on French soil. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, the French military elite began to plan for a future in which defense, not attack, would be the cornerstone of national security. Out of that determination grew the Maginot Line, a project that would consume billions of francs, reshape French strategy, and create one of the most famous fortification systems in history. The French logic was straightforward. They had fewer people than Germany, their birth rate had slowed, and they feared that if another war of attrition erupted, they simply could not replace the manpower they had lost between 1914 and 1918. Their generals studied the battlefields of the First World War and concluded that technology machine guns, barbed wire, artillery favored the defender. If defense could stop German attacks in open fields, then permanent, reinforced, and heavily armed positions of steel and concrete would be even stronger. The answer, they believed, was to make France literally untouchable. This philosophy found a champion in André Maginot, Minister of War and veteran of the trenches, who argued that modern fortifications could buy time for mobilization, discourage invasion, and protect the nation from being bled white once again. By the late 1920s, the French Chamber of Deputies authorized the creation of a massive line of defenses stretching from Switzerland to Luxembourg. Construction began under the supervision of the Commission d'Organisation des Régions Fortifiées, which coordinated engineers, contractors, and the military. The plan was ambitious: interconnected fortresses, each one armed with artillery pieces hidden behind armored turrets, each bunker designed to withstand heavy bombardment, each sector able to cover the others with interlocking fields of fire. Inside the line, subterranean tunnels connected barracks, command posts, hospitals, power stations, and supply depots. Troops could move unseen from one section to another. In some fortresses, underground trains transported ammunition and food. Soldiers could live there for weeks or even months, sealed off from the outside world if necessary, confident that no German bombardment could dig them out. The Maginot Line was more than concrete. It was a symbol. French newspapers trumpeted it as the greatest fortress in Europe. Journalists toured completed sections and returned with glowing descriptions of underground barracks as comfortable as city apartments. Photographs of armored gun turrets sliding silently out of the earth appeared in illustrated magazines. Politicians held ceremonies to celebrate the progress. For ordinary French citizens, especially those in border regions who had suffered directly from the German invasion in 1914, the line offered reassurance that their homes and farms were safe. Veterans who had endured gas attacks and human wave assaults embraced the idea that their children would never again face such horror. Yet the project was enormously expensive. Billions of francs poured into the effort, funds that might otherwise have been spent on tanks, aircraft, or modernization of the army. Critics in the French Assembly warned that investing too heavily in static defenses was dangerous in a world where mobility, speed, and mechanized units were increasingly important. But those voices were drowned out. After all, the public wanted reassurance, not talk of offensive wars. And for politicians still haunted by the slaughter of the trenches, concrete and steel seemed far safer investments than tanks and bombers. The Maginot Line did not cover the entire frontier. To the south, it ended at the Swiss border. To the north, it extended only as far as Luxembourg. Beyond that point stretched the frontier with Belgium. French strategists had deliberately left this sector uncovered, believing that in the event of war, Germany would once again violate Belgian neutrality, just as it had in 1914. The French army planned to meet that attack by advancing into Belgium and fighting there, rather than fortifying the border and straining the Franco-Belgian alliance. This decision created a gap that German planners studied with great interest. Still, in the French imagination, the Maginot Line appeared unbreakable. Schoolbooks described it as impregnable. Politicians invoked it as proof that the nation was secure. Inside the bunkers, soldiers trained in relative comfort. They had heating, ventilation, electric lighting, kitchens, even medical facilities. Compared to the mud and blood of the trenches, life inside the Maginot Line was considered almost luxurious. French officers boasted that their men could fight indefinitely, protected by meters of reinforced concrete. Visiting British officers remarked on the sophistication of the design and the efficiency of the layout. American military observers touring the fortifications in the 1930s were struck by the scale of the investment and the thoroughness of the defenses. To foreign eyes, the French had indeed built the strongest fortress system in the world. German generals, however, studied the line with a more skeptical eye. They respected its strength but recognized its limits. Fortifications, no matter how elaborate, were fixed in place. Mobile armies could maneuver around them, bypassing their guns. German analysts noted that the line did not extend through Belgium, and that possibility shaped their future plans. Still, in public and in propaganda, the French boasted that Germany would never dare to attack. The fortress became a psychological weapon as much as a military one. The mythology surrounding the Maginot Line grew. Politicians assured voters that the sacrifices of the First World War had built a permanent guarantee of peace. Posters declared that, behind this line, France is secure. Schoolchildren were taken on excursions to see the bunkers. The message was simple. Never again would German soldiers march unopposed into French villages. The trauma of 1914 was buried in concrete, but the illusion of invincibility carried risks. By pouring so many resources into the line, France starved other parts of its military of investment. Tank development lagged, air power was neglected, strategic thinking became locked into a defensive mindset. Generals believed they could rely on the fortresses to hold the frontier, giving them time to mobilize slowly without the need for rapid offensive action. This defensive doctrine shaped everything from training exercises to budget priorities. France would not attack first. It would endure behind its walls, waiting for the enemy to exhaust itself. Inside the government, debates raged, though often quietly. Some military thinkers argued that the next war would be different, that fast-moving armored divisions and aircraft could leap over fixed fortifications. They pointed to experiments in Germany with mechanized warfare, to exercises showing the potential of blitzkrieg-style tactics. Yet their warnings carried little political weight. France was traumatized, tired of war, and eager for security. The concrete bunkers, not the tank battalions, reassured the public. By the late 1930s, as tensions rose in Europe, the Maginot Line was virtually complete. It stretched nearly 450 miles, with hundreds of forts, casemates, and artillery positions. It represented one of the greatest military engineering projects in history. But it also represented a profound gamble, the belief that the next German war would look like the last, that static defenses could hold back modern armies. It was a gamble born from trauma, cemented by politics, and celebrated as a triumph of French ingenuity. The truth, however, was that the line was both a marvel and a trap. It was indeed formidable where it existed, but it tied French strategy to a static vision of warfare. It lulled a weary nation into believing that concrete alone could guarantee safety. It shaped military doctrine that emphasized defense at the expense of mobility. And it convinced French generals that Germany would never dare to test it. In the spring of 1940, that assumption would be shattered. But in the 1930s, as the bunkers gleamed with fresh concrete and soldiers drilled in their underground quarters, the Maginot Line was seen as the ultimate answer to the fears born in the trenches of the Great War. For France, the Maginot Line was not just a wall. It was a state of mind, a promise to a scarred nation that history would not repeat itself. Billions of francs bought more than steel and concrete. They bought peace of mind. But that peace was built on a dangerous illusion, the belief that the future could be walled off with the lessons of the past. That illusion would cost dearly when the storm finally came. In the spring of 1940, the fortress line that France had spent more than a decade building stood quiet, manned by thousands of soldiers who believed they were secure behind walls of concrete and steel. For years, the French public had been told that the Maginot Line guaranteed safety, that no German assault could ever break through its bunkers. German commanders knew it was formidable, but they also knew something else. Fortifications are only as strong as the assumptions behind them. If the French had locked their strategy into defending where the bunkers stood, then the key to victory lay in moving where the bunkers were not. The Wehrmacht, studying maps and terrain, searching for weaknesses, found their answer in the forests and hills of the Ardennes. What the French considered a natural barrier too dense for armored divisions, the Germans saw as a corridor to outflank the strongest defenses in Europe. The plan that emerged was known as Fall Gelb Case Yellow. It was drafted and refined under the influence of Germany's most daring military thinkers, then shaped into final form by General Erich von Manstein. Rather than smashing directly into the Maginot Line, as the French expected, German armies would feint into Belgium, drawing the best of the French and British armies northward. Then, while the Allies rushed to meet this apparent threat, a massive German armored thrust would drive through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and sweep into the French rear. The Maginot Line would remain intact, its guns silent, while German tanks bypassed it completely, cutting off French armies and collapsing the defensive system from behind. The idea seemed reckless to many, even within Germany. The Ardennes were thickly wooded, crossed by narrow, winding roads, and considered by most French officers impassable for large, mechanized formations. During the interwar years, French military studies had declared the region unsuitable for heavy armor. Engineers and staff officers insisted that German divisions could not push hundreds of tanks through such terrain without creating bottlenecks vulnerable to air attack and artillery. These assumptions shaped French deployment. The Ardennes was lightly defended, manned by second-rate divisions of reservists and older troops who were told their task was simply to delay any enemy while the main battle unfolded elsewhere. But the Germans thought differently. They believed that what seemed impossible was merely difficult, and that speed, surprise, and concentration could turn the Ardennes from a barrier into a highway. General Heinz Guderian, architect of armored warfare, argued that tanks could move through the region if traffic was strictly controlled and units were trained to push forward without pause. He had overseen exercises demonstrating that armored columns could indeed pass through narrow roads if carefully organized. German high command embraced the risk. They reasoned that because the French thought such a maneuver impossible, it would be the last place they expected the decisive blow. In May 1940, the plan was put into action. On the 10th of May, German forces launched their offensive. Army Group B under General Fedor von Bock surged into Belgium and the Netherlands. This was the bait. The Allies responded exactly as the Germans had hoped. French and British troops rushed northward to meet the attack, committing their best armored units and first-class infantry into Belgium. Newspapers in Paris reported confidently that the war would be fought once again on Belgian soil, just as in 1914. Meanwhile, Army Group A, under General Gerd von Rundstedt, prepared its strike through the Ardennes. In the forests, German armored divisions moved in tightly packed columns stretching for miles. Thousands of vehicles, tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and supply convoys snaked along the narrow roads. From the air, it looked like a traffic jam, and indeed the danger was immense. A single well-placed French airstrike could have crippled the advance, but the French Air Force was poorly coordinated and held back for fear of German reprisals. Reconnaissance flights spotted some German movement, but French commanders dismissed the reports. They assumed the Ardennes was a diversion, not the main thrust. Within days, the German columns emerged from the forests and reached the Meuse River near Sedan. French planners had believed that this sector could hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive, but the reality was different. The units stationed there were undertrained, under-equipped, and poorly led. On May 13th, after massive Luftwaffe bombing runs that shattered French morale, German infantry and tanks forced crossings of the Meuse. French defenses crumbled with alarming speed. General Guderian's armored divisions poured across pontoon bridges, spreading out into the open countryside beyond. What had been labeled impossible moving armored divisions through the Ardennes was now a stunning success. For the French High Command, the realization came too late. While their strongest forces were engaged in Belgium, the Germans had broken through at Sedan and were driving westward with incredible momentum. The Maginot Line, to the south, remained intact but irrelevant. Its guns could not pivot to stop the tanks sweeping behind them. The fortress system had been bypassed in a matter of days. German generals had not needed to confront its concrete walls head-on. They had simply rendered it obsolete by maneuver. The brilliance of the maneuver lay in its simplicity. Instead of battering against the strongest part of the French defense, the Germans struck where they were least expected. It was a textbook demonstration of the principle of Schwerpunkt concentration of force at a decisive point. And it exposed the fatal flaw in French strategy, their overconfidence in fixed fortifications and their failure to anticipate the speed of modern mechanized warfare. As the German armored spearheads advanced, panic spread among French commanders. Communication broke down, orders lagged behind events, and entire armies risked encirclement. The British Expeditionary Force, along with French forces in Belgium, suddenly found themselves cut off, their supply lines severed. The Maginot Line, far to the south, still stood strong, its garrisons waiting for attacks that never came. German infantry made only limited assaults against its fortresses, content to contain them while the main offensive bypassed them completely. The maneuver through the Ardennes became the centerpiece of the 1940 campaign. Within weeks, France collapsed. The speed of the German advance shocked the world. The supposedly impregnable Maginot Line had not been breached, it had been sidestepped. Billions of francs of concrete and steel were neutralized not by direct assault, but by imagination and daring. German generals had proved that even the strongest fortress is useless if the enemy refuses to attack it. The lesson was profound. Military historians later noted that the fall of France was not due to weak soldiers or poor equipment, but to flawed doctrine and misplaced faith. By trusting too much in static defenses, France had blinded itself to the mobility and innovation that defined modern warfare. The Germans had gambled on the Ardennes and won, turning what was thought to be impassable into the very path of victory. Personal accounts from both sides captured the shock. French soldiers in the Maginot Line wrote letters describing the eerie quiet, wondering why no German assault came. Meanwhile, troops in Belgium found themselves surrounded, cut off by armored columns they had been told could never advance through the forests. German tank crews marveled at the speed of their success, often encountering French units that surrendered in confusion, unable to grasp how the enemy had appeared behind them so quickly. The bypass of the Maginot Line through the Ardennes was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a revolution in the understanding of war. It proved that speed, coordination, and surprise could overturn even the most expensive fortifications. It proved that wars would not be decided by walls of concrete, but by mobile forces striking where the enemy least expected. And it revealed, with devastating clarity, that the French had prepared for the last war, while the Germans had prepared for the next. In May 1940, German tanks rolling through the Ardennes exposed the fatal flaw of the Maginot Line. The fortress had not failed in itself. It had failed because its existence blinded its creators to the reality of modern war. And as those armored divisions surged toward the Channel, France's fate was sealed not by the weakness of its walls, but by the strength of German imagination. When the German armored spearheads burst through the Ardennes in May 1940 and fanned out across northern France, the fate of the Maginot Line was sealed. The fortresses stood as formidable as ever, their guns loaded, their crews waiting for assaults that never came. But the war was no longer unfolding in front of their walls. It was sweeping around them, cutting supply lines, isolating garrisons, and rendering billions of francs of steel and concrete irrelevant. This was the ultimate tragedy of the Maginot Line. It did not fall because it was weak, but because it was bypassed. Its greatest strength, its immobility, was also its fatal flaw. And as the Wehrmacht encircled French armies, the consequences cascaded across the nation with shocking speed. Reports flooded into French high command, describing German tanks already in the rear. Columns of refugees clogged the roads, making it nearly impossible for reserves to move forward. French generals, trained to think in terms of weeks and months, were stunned to see the front disintegrate in days. The Maginot Line still stood, but its relevance evaporated. Units stationed inside the fortresses could fire only into empty fields. German infantry simply contained them, leaving minimal forces to keep the bunkers isolated, while the armored thrusts rolled toward Paris. For French soldiers who had placed their faith in the line, the experience was bewildering. Letters recovered later describe long days underground with little combat, while rumors spread of German tanks far to the west. Some fortresses held out for weeks after the armistice, refusing to surrender until ordered. In places like Hackenberg and Schonenburg, garrisons endured bombing and shelling but remained intact. They had been designed to resist, and they did. But resistance in the wrong place meant nothing. Soldiers emerging from their fortresses after the surrender were shocked to see German flags already flying across France. They had fought bravely, but the war had moved past them. The collapse of the French front in June 1940 was as much psychological as military. The Maginot Line had been sold to the French public as a guarantee of security. Its fall, or more accurately, its irrelevance, was therefore shattering. Newspapers that once published glowing stories of impregnable bunkers now reported the shocking advance of German forces around them. Civilians who had believed that concrete walls would protect their villages now watched as German troops arrived from unexpected directions. The myth of safety collapsed overnight, leaving a nation in despair. The broader consequences were devastating. Within 6 weeks of the initial German attack, France, one of the world's great powers, capitulated. An armistice was signed, dividing the country into an occupied zone and a collaborationist regime headquartered in Vichy. The image of French soldiers behind their bunkers, waiting for a battle that never came, became symbolic of strategic blindness. To the rest of the world, the Maginot Line stood as a monument to outdated thinking. But even in defeat, there were lessons. Military analysts after the war studied the campaign closely. They noted that the fortresses themselves had performed as designed. They resisted bombardment, their crews endured under fire, and their artillery inflicted casualties when engaged. The problem was never the concrete, it was the doctrine. The French had assumed that fortifications could anchor an entire strategy. They assumed the enemy would attack head-on, repeating the attritional patterns of the First World War. They assumed time would be on their side. All of those assumptions collapsed in the face of blitzkrieg. For the Germans, the victory validated their belief in speed, surprise, and maneuver. By concentrating armored forces through the Ardennes and exploiting weakly held sectors, they proved that static defenses could be rendered meaningless. This lesson would resonate throughout the remainder of the war. In 1944, when the Allies built their own fortifications along the beaches of Normandy, they too discovered that strong walls could be defeated, not by smashing through them, but by going around, outflanking or overwhelming them with unexpected tactics. The fall of France also reshaped Allied strategy. In Britain, military leaders recognized that relying solely on fixed defenses, like the coastal batteries facing the Channel, would not be enough. Mobility, air power, and rapid reaction forces became central. In the United States, planners studied the Maginot Line as a cautionary tale, emphasizing that war in the modern age required flexibility. Fixed fortifications could play a role, but they could not be the cornerstone of national defense. The consequences for France were profound. Occupation brought hardship, rationing, repression, and resistance. The nation that had trusted in concrete now faced years of humiliation. The memory of the Maginot Line became a bitter reminder of misplaced faith. Even today, the phrase Maginot Line is often used as a metaphor for false security, for any defense that seems impressive but fails to address the real threat. Yet, it is important to remember that the line itself was not a joke. The soldiers who manned it were dedicated, the engineers who built it were brilliant, and the forts themselves were nearly indestructible. The tragedy lies in how they were used, or rather, how they were not used. By tying themselves to a defensive system that could be bypassed, French leaders surrendered initiative. They placed their trust in the past rather than the future. When war came, the cost of that mistake was nothing less than national collapse. In the years since, military historians have debated whether the Maginot Line was doomed from the start. Some argue that no fortress system could have saved France in 1940, given Germany's tactical innovation and air superiority. Others argue that if the line had been integrated into a flexible, mobile strategy, it could have bought critical time. What is undeniable is that the psychological blow of seeing the impregnable defenses rendered irrelevant shattered French morale. Armies can recover from battlefield losses, but when a nation loses faith in its strategy, defeat comes swiftly. The story of the Maginot Line is therefore more than a tale of bunkers and battlefields. It is a lesson in human thinking, in the dangers of preparing for yesterday's war instead of tomorrow's. It shows how trauma can shape decisions, how politics can drive strategy, and how comfort can blind leaders to reality. It reminds us that no wall, no matter how thick, can protect against imagination, daring, and speed. As the dust settled in the summer of 1940, French generals looked back in disbelief. They had trusted in their fortresses, in their calculations, in their assumptions. They discovered too late that their enemy had written a new playbook. The collapse of France was not inevitable, but it was the product of choices, to trust in concrete rather than mobility, in permanence rather than flexibility. The Maginot Line, once a symbol of security, became a symbol of failure, and that is why the phrase still resonates today. The Maginot Line is invoked whenever someone builds an expensive defense against the wrong threat, whenever people mistake strength on paper for security in reality. It is a reminder that true safety lies not in walls, but in adaptability. If you've stayed with this story of France's great fortress, you now understand why it failed and why its legacy endures. History is not just about the past, it is about the choices we make in the present, the lessons we carry forward, and the dangers of believing that old solutions will solve new problems. The Maginot Line was a monument to misplaced confidence, and its downfall changed the course of Europe. If you want more deep dives into forgotten stories of the Second World War, if you want to understand how decisions, strategies, and technologies shape the lives of millions, then make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this video. Your support helps bring more hidden chapters of history to light and ensures that the lessons of the past are never forgotten.